Hi, I'm Gavin,
And I'm Dave.
and you're on the fringe.
Come along with us for a ride on a podcast where we talk about an area or a thing going on in the world that needs more attention, just like you do. Let's go.
On the fringe. Here we go. Hey, 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 welcome to On the Fringe. I'm Gavin Lucky, and I'm here with Dave and
Howdy.
our first guest of the podcast, Stuart. Stuart B.
Hello, nice to meet you all.
Hey, thanks for coming on.
Very happy for you to be here, Stuart. Uh, Stuart is a old friend and a bit of an expert in African politics, and we are very happy to have you here today. We're going to be talking about the significance of a rising political and public figure, I would say, in West African and really Pan-African politics. Uh, Stuart, who is Ibrahim Traoré?
Yeah, it's a very loaded question. I guess the most basic answer is he is currently I guess you call him president of the nation of Burkina Faso, which could be located in West Africa, north of Ghana, south of Mali. And
Hmm.
he's been in power since the end of 2022. So I guess around 2.5 years, a bit over that. And he is probably Africa's most talked about man currently. That's how to introduce him, I suppose.
Now, why do you think that is? Because I know I've heard various theories as to why that's the case, but what's your take on this guy's, I don't want to use the word notoriety, but he is very much talked about on the continent and in the diaspora as well.
I would say Africans, myself, a disclosure, I'm half Ghanaian and I've spent quite a lot of time in Ghana and I've traveled around West Africa in my past. And I'll basically say that he is someone who uh, they've waited for because he's young. He is very idealistic and he is very different from the kind of leaders they've had in the past, whereby, old men who spend a lot of their time in European capitals and don't really achieve very much. He's a young man in the military who seems to be very clear about what he wants. And many young African people look up to him as a sort of inspiration of what sort of leadership they've been crying out for. Because I think in many African countries, the problem is when it comes to an election, you have besuited elite number one and then besuited elite number two, and each one is offering very much of the same. He is somewhat very different to that.
Now,
Right. I was doing a little bit of
sorry.
research, and he was a captain in the Burkina army before he became president, correct?
Yes. And he
Or took
technically still
power.
is a captain. He
Oh,
never
really?
promoted
Okay.
himself. Yes.
So I just want to pick up on one thing you said about you said he's very idealistic, and you said people support what he wants, what he stands for. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
I think to give people listening the best sort of ideas about why they like him, especially in Burkina Faso, is he follows a tradition where Burkina Faso in the 80s had another captain who took over the
Hmm.
country, a man called Thomas Sankara. He was very left wing, in the realms of the Cold War. Uh, and he was in power for 4 years and he had earned in freedom, I guess you can call it, by saying, like, we don't want to be just begging for aid all the time and just getting scraps. We want more than that. Ibrahim Traore basically follows that. I mean, he even kind of wears the same sort of military fatigues as Thomas Sankara. Thomas Sankara was assassinated by his second in command, a man called Blaise Compaoré. who then ran the country for around 27 years, and I guess you can say pretty much stagnated. Any of the developments which were going through Sankara's time stagnated, and when he was overthrown in 2014, it created a very turbulent period. And through that period of turbulence, Ibrahim Traoré has come up from that. And so he comes across as, again, I mean, it's hard to say he's left wing per se, because I think, the world which Thomas Sankara was in and Traore is in is different. But again, it's still the development in freedom. One of the things is, being an ex-colony of France, they said, we don't want to basically have anything to do with France anymore. So he's become quite close to Russia, and I guess you could say that he goes to them for guidance and for military aid, because Burkina Faso is currently in the grips of a crisis where about 40% of the country is under control of armed Islamic groups, which the government is finding it very difficult to contain. But he is doing quite a few social programs, and I mean, the way I'll describe him is I know people across the continent from Kenya, from Equatorial Guinea, South Africa, and all of them know about him, and all of them are talking about him. And it's got to a point where I would say stories about him now, it's sometimes hard to separate the fact from the fiction, because any kind of good story about Africa is somehow kind of linked to him, and it's difficult to know, if he's actually enacted a certain policy or if it's just kind of propaganda you're hearing. But I would even say it's even unclear if he is even himself aware of the propaganda around him, if it's just spreading by itself. So he's just become this figure. It's hard to, he doesn't give that many interviews, right? So it's kind of hard to know where the man ends and where the kind of legendary is being built around him begins.
It's interesting. So, is there kind of a cult of personality developing around this guy? And like, is that coming primarily from Africans or is it more from outside of Africa?
That's a very good question. Is there cult of personality being built around him? Yes. Is he the one doing it? Hard to say. Definitely, you can say that he, his Russian allies definitely are feeding it. Because I mean, there has been allegation, but certain like Russian accounts, the ones pushing out some of the stories about him, which may not, which giving stories which aren't exactly true. But it is growing, I would say, naturally just across the continent at this point. When I was in Ghana a few weeks ago, taxi drivers having his picture in their taxis, and people talk about him, people selling Burkina flags at the roadside, which is something which, if I got into a taxi in Ghana a couple of years ago, there would never be a picture of the Burkina president, because it just wasn't important. That's changed now. So definitely, like, the love for him and the excitement around him, even if it's being pushed by propaganda, is real and it's palpable. And yeah, everyone is talking about it.
Man, that is interesting. That is crazy. Um, I
It's pretty. Sorry, can I
yeah,
butt in?
jump in there.
I'll butt in, Dave. I'm sorry.
Hmm.
Just right on that. You were talking about just a little more context. Traore emerges from the ongoing war in Burkina.
Yes.
So he doesn't show up before, he doesn't show up after. This is a conflict that's still going on. And it had
Mm,
already kind of, we're seeing the beginnings of it right before the end of the Campare regime.
mm.
Uh, but it's been building and building and building. And I think, as you said, over 40% of the country is not actually under the control of the government.
Yeah.
So, I mean, don't you think that this is a very strange state of affairs where you have this military leader who's incredibly popular? Uh, I think he is popular in Burkina. He's popular outside of Burkina, but he's also in charge of a military conflict, and he's a military leader that he does not
Yes.
seem to be winning.
Yeah, I think the way I'll say that is he he's not winning the conflict currently. That's true, but I guess I can contest that none of his predecessors were winning it either. And I think you could say I don't know if this conflict is winnable in its current form.
Hmm.
Um, and he came to power in a sort of not a counter coup, but there was a coup just under a year before, which ousted the civilian government and was run by a man called Paul Damiba. And that basically only lasted about 8 or 9 months
Hmm.
when it became clear that that man had basically no idea how to win this thing. And then it became a junior officers coup, which you have seen in Africa before, where they take over because they're the ones closer to the ground, they're the ones fighting, and they're the ones who kind of realize the leadership is completely incompetent and we want to take over. And so he comes to the fore. But
Yeah.
we have to understand as well that it's not just Burkina Faso in a vacuum who's having this sort of fight. Its neighbors, Niger and Mali, are also deep in this fight with Islamic jihadist elements, and all of them have banded together to fight this menace. And they've also seceded from the regional political organization ECOWAS, which stands for the Economic Community of West African States, because they feel that ECOWAS and them do not see eye to eye about how to manage the situation. And it's partly because Burkina Faso and its fellow countries, Mali and Niger, are all military juntas. And then basically the way they're going to be dealing with this crisis is very different to the way they feel democratic countries would be.
Well, I'm thinking here, he's getting more legitimacy by building relationships and supporting Niger and Mali, correct? Where these three countries are essentially banding together, and even if they do kind of become, the ass of
Mm,
ECOWAS, the Association of Sahel States,
mm,
then these three states can go, okay, the three of us are together. We're bound together. We're going to stand up and support each other regardless of what conflicts that come our way. And the rest of you guys in ECOWAS, you can be your kind of ragtag, disseparated, disjointed group of other states. And I don't know where I'm going with this, I guess. Kind of lost my train of thought there. But
no, I can answer kind of what you're trying to say about the
yeah.
differences between the Alliance of Sahelian states, but they use the French acronym AES
Mm-hmm.
and
For obvious
ECOWAS.
reasons, Dave.
Yes, and
Yeah.
it comes from ECOWAS. It exists to be like, oh, this is basically representing West Africa, and we support development and democracy. And they've been around since 1975, so it's actually their 50-year anniversary was in fact this week. But the issue with
Oh,
them
what a
is
time.
yes, but the issue is many people feel it's become a bit of a president's club where they have meetings and they make statements, but nothing happens on the ground. They've been talking about having a joint currency for decades. It's never happened. And elections in this region, there are many allegations in certain countries where elections are rigged, and ECOWAS doesn't seem to do anything about that. There's many examples of presidents abusing their authority. ECOWAS also is silent about that. The only time they pipe up is when there's a military takeover and they say, oh, no, that's not allowed. But then many citizens are saying, when a president rigs an election, you're silent. When a president is, basically raiding the national treasury for their own personal ends, you're silent. And it's only when soldiers take over, and, many African countries, the reality is the elite of the society, they don't serve in the army, right? If you're an elite in an African country, you're abroad in New York having fun, right? You're not sitting in a barracks in a small forested area or an arid desert, right? So you tend to have a different part of society in the army. So they they can bring a sort of sense of legitimacy as we're closer to the people than the elites are. And so there is this feeling of ECOWAS is more in touch with those elites than the people of these nations. And they'll say that ECOWAS barely represents us I don't, if you ask people in West Africa, what does ECOWAS do for you? I mean, a lot of them would really struggle to give you an answer. And so the AES basically saying, we're going to look at this differently. We're all military leaders, but we take our legitimacy from the fact we're fighting to defend our countries, end of. Is that democratic? Not really. But they say it doesn't matter because some people would say if your country's under siege in such a way, it's hard to keep a democracy going.
Interesting. So it's more the voice of the people is reflected by AES, and ECOWAS is more just the voice of the people that have had power in the old institutions, I guess, quote institutions in
Yes.
West Africa. Okay.
Mm.
And I mean, I think the sort of relations have completely reached a nodder. Have they opened the borders, Stuart? I haven't been following this, but the
Yeah,
border,
I don't think the borders are closed anymore because when I
yeah,
was in Ghana, I didn't hear anything that you couldn't go to Burkina Faso. And also being in
you
Ghana,
would
I
have.
saw like trucks going up north, which with a
Yeah.
Burkina Faso number plate, which made me believe, okay, they're probably going to Burkina Faso after picking stuff up from the ports that are on the coast. So there is some reconciliation. I mean, when Ghana's new president was inaugurated in January, Traoré came to that inauguration, and that was seen as a big reconciliation sort of prize because the previous government in Ghana did not get on with Traore and actually kind of tattled on him to the Americans by saying, "Oh, he's bringing in the Russians. He's giving them resources. You need to deal with that," which went down very badly, as you can imagine. So there is a sense of, oh, we need to work with these countries. They're still our neighbors, but I mean, in the Sahel, there is still a lot of distrust between the Alliance of Sahelian states and ECOWAS. And while there can be some reconciliation, the idea that these countries will rejoin ECOWAS, I think, is probably, as it stands, impossible.
Well, it's actually, I'm glad you brought that up because one of the things that I wanted to talk about is, in fact, there's more of a concern, I'd say, in some quarters, that the EAS will actually expand into ECOWAS instead of getting reabsorbed, which I mean, I think you and I agree is very unlikely at this point.
Mm, mm,
Um, recently murmurings about, I mean, there are always murmurings about Chad, which we're not going to
yes.
talk about today because Chad is its own giant kettle of fish. But murmurings about Chad, in murmurings about our little friend in Togo, um,
Yes.
which could you just talk about that a little bit more?
So Togo's an interesting one because I've seen reports on that. I mean, all the reports are whispers, right? It's like, oh, people
Mhm.
have said that Togo is potentially interested, and it's true that the Togolese president he presented himself as a mediator from ECOWAS to the Sahelian states, and it seems his reconciliation outfits have been so good that he actually wants to join them now, and pretty much I would say he's probably positioning himself saying, I would like to join. One is that, the president of Togo, he basically does not care about democracy. He inherited the presidency from his father, and he's been in
Mhm.
power for 20 years and has changed the constitution so that he can't be voted out of office. So this is a man who democracy is not something he cares about in the least. So he doesn't really care that these leaders are military juntas because democracy is not a thing for him. And he'll position himself as if you allow Togo to join, I can give you the port of Lomé. I can
Yeah.
give you coastal access for the Atlantic on that side because all the Sahelian states currently are all landlocked, and so one of the issues they're trying to get is where can we best have an access to the Atlantic. Morocco is offering one to them. I think that'll be via Mali, but yeah, there's been a recent like military games thing for the Sicilian states, and the
Mhm.
Togolese were part of it, which is leading to a lot of eyebrows being raised, saying, "Is Togo really going to do this?" And if they were to formally join, I mean, they'd have to probably leave ECOWAS, so ECOWAS wouldn't allow them to be part of both. And
It would
that
split. It would physically split ECOWAS in half, wouldn't it?
that's the thing. ECOWAS currently is still a one continuous unit, right? You could walk from Nigeria to Senegal if you went by the coast. If Togo was to join, I would say the future of ECOWAS as an actual entity would be really in question because
Yeah.
if you have a country which doesn't actually have a military ruler join that, then it really leads to question why are people staying in ECOWAS? What is the point actually? There may even be populations in other countries who may even want to join the AES, which you might have to contend with. I would say definitely a space to watch. Ever since it started, Gavin and I have been talking about it a lot because I would say in African politics, this is probably the most interesting development we've seen post Cold War.
It is, and it really continues to be in so many ways. Just to pick up, I think one thing, and then we can wrap this up. So, yes, the end of ECOWAS is a continuous state. Just to go back to what we were talking about at the beginning with Traoré,
Mm,
I think one of the issues, and again, we've talked about this extensively, one of the issues that ECOWAS has had throughout the, I would say, post-Cold War Sahelian crisis has been that lack of charismatic figures.
mm,
Um, if we're looking at the coastal states, if we're looking at Ghana, if we're looking at Nigeria, if we're looking at Senegal, even though Senegal's maybe a little bit different, um, there's a general lack of what I would call charismatic political figures.
yeah,
Um, they're not,
Yeah.
if they do have an appeal, it tends to be very local or even sectional.
yes.
And the thing about Traore, the thing that makes him so fascinating is his appeal seems to cut right across all of these divisions.
Yeah, he is someone where, as I said, people from East Africa, South Africa, and West Africa are following him in a way which I don't think any African leader since Nelson Mandela has had that sort of following. And you could say that Nelson Mandela's situation was very unique in comparison. Being in prison for so long and having the attention of the West. Ibrahim Traoré is a man who I think, as you say, the lack of charisma of many leaders is also that there's many of them, you look at them and you can kind of just tell if something was to go wrong in their country, they have a bolt hole in Paris, in London, in New York, they can just run away to, right?
Hmm.
They've got money stashed away somewhere. And even though they're running their country, they have a backup plan, which doesn't even include being in the country itself. Traore is a man much like Sankara, because I would say when Sankara was assassinated, they the people who took over said, oh, he was actually stealing money, and when they opened his bank account, he had like $400 in there, and they went to his house. He just, it was pretty normal. He didn't steal money in that way. Traore, no, I can't tell. I don't know the man's bank accounts or anything, but if you were to ask me, do I think he has private penthouses in Paris? I think the answer is probably no, right? It's just that's not what really motivates him. And that's not why he took over the country, because he was a man who was basically in the line of duty where, he was probably willing to die for his country to fight this threat. He is focused on it. Now, the ways he's trying to manage the situation, he has some supporters, he has detractors, like any leader does, but he is willing to stand up to Western powers in the way many African leaders in the past have been afraid to.
Mhm.
And he says things which I'd say many African people have said in their houses, in their social spaces, but have not seen their leaders repeat these remarks. He's willing to do it, and that resonates with a lot of people, and they really want to see him succeed. And I'll even say it's gotten to the point where there are some Western powers, probably France, because he's really ruptured the relationship France had with Burkina Faso, who would probably be happy, very happy, if he left. I think it's got to the point where even if they were to remove him, it wouldn't actually matter at this point. The legend of him has gone beyond who he is as a person and what he represents and his ideals. will create copycats in the future. Whether they fully align with the ideals, they just use the images to try and get what they want is up for debate. But he represents, I would say, a beating heart of African ideology of how they want to be self-determination. I'll say Thomas Sankara maybe was the first incarnation of that. He is the second, and he will inspire more.
Wow.
Interesting.
Well,
And
thank you
I
so much,
oh,
Stuart.
Oh, no
Go ahead.
problem.
Yeah, thank you
I was
so
gonna
much, Stuart, for coming in and just giving that wonderful, wonderful sort of exposition on a very complex and moving situation, and just giving us some background on that. Yeah, just here on the fringe. Thank you so much. You want to shout us off, Dave?
Yeah, thank you very much to all of our listeners, our subscribers, to Stuart, to Gavin, and to you for jumping in. We look forward to having you on the next episode. Take care.